The RAN Research Seminar in Amsterdam on October 17, 2018 brought together researchers, practitioners and policymakers to discuss ways to improve collaboration, such as exchanging ideas about how research on preventing and countering violent extremism and radicalization can feed into the work of practitioners and the priorities of policymakers. Despite their different needs and schedules, cooperation is necessary. From the Swedish National Defence College, Magnus Ranstorp, Quality Manager at the RAN Centre of Excellence, explains the issues raised by the High-Level Commission Expert Group on Radicalization in May 2018.
The report has really sort of signaled ahead what are the priority areas that we should focus in on in order to be effective both for research, but more importantly for policy. So we need to sort of bridge the policy practitioner and research gap.
Roxanne Foroughmand from the Scientific Committee on Radicalization Processes in France recounts when academic research became important in the field of radicalization.
In France was the 2015 terrorist attack in Paris. As you have heard, it was the most murderous attack in France since the World War II. There was a need to better understand this phenomenon through more analysis and researches. So since this event, many actions were taken, like, for example, in a few days after the 2015 terrorist attacks, the former president of the National Center of Scientific Research, Alain Fuchs, addressed the academic community with a call for research proposals. So it was related to the issues facing our society following the terrorist attack and their consequences in order to pave the way to new social, technical and digital solutions. And there was also the creation in May 2017 of the Scientific Committee on Radicalization Processes.
In Belgium, the need to build connections between researchers and practitioners is also relatively new. Thomas Renard from the Egmont Institute in Brussels explains.
I think the first thing to point out when it comes to the relationship between researchers and practitioners in Belgium is that this, in the field of radicalization and terrorism, this was nearly inexistent until recently. And over the past few years, we have seen various ministries, various services, and particularly security services, intelligence and police, opening up to academia and sharing more their analysis, perceptions, and even data with researchers. This still mostly happen within a very narrow community. It's not really institutionalized yet, but we are getting there. I mean, this is really my feeling. We are getting there, and this is obviously a trend to be encouraged because, generally speaking, the practitioners, they have the data, they have the sensitivity, they have the hands-on approach, whereas the researchers come with a certain knowledge, perhaps a little bit of distance, which is necessary and needed in this field as well, historical perspective, and I think this is only a natural meeting between these two worlds, but perhaps we need to institutionalize this still a little bit more and a little bit better, creating partnership between certain services or ministries and the scientific bodies, for instance, in Belgium. There are some projects ongoing, but I think we could push this much further still.
On the other side of the Atlantic, the situation is the same. Brett Kubicek from the Canada Centre for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence stresses the need to connect research and practice.
It's difficult to sort of take a model and apply it in one city versus another. So what we're trying to shift towards is connecting research more with guidelines for practice. Like, how do you specifically deal with a particular problem? Or how do you, we just talked in the last session about family members and how do you support families? So, thinking about what do we know about an example like that, and rather than having a big model. So that's an area where research has changed. It's becoming a lot more focused on a specific problem, specific needs of practitioners, and then figuring out how we can support them with more evidence.
Nevertheless, Mr. Kubicek highlights the good collaboration between researchers and policymakers in Canada.
I see policymakers every day. The way we're set up is that my research team is co-located with a policy team. So we're regularly having these conversations. I think a good example on that front, we've talked a bit about sort of community-based work, but we're also Canada is one of the countries that engages with the big social media companies through something called the Global Internet Forum to Counter-terrorism. And so we've got some really big questions on how do we improve prevention and intervention in the online space. So that's one where there's big policy questions happening and a real desire to get better at asking them and coming up with more useful evidence for what can work in a prevention space online. So yes, we're very engaged with our policy colleagues.
For Bibi van Ginkel from the Security Unit Clingendael Institute and the International Center for Counter-terrorism in the Netherlands, cooperation between researchers, policymakers and practitioners begins with good analysis.
Not often all these different stakeholders are involved in all phases of the policy cycle. And so a good policy cycle starts with an analysis of the problem, and maybe not only of the problem of today, but also investing in future foresight, in looking ahead to be ahead of the curve.
More extensive access to data could improve the cooperation between researchers and practitioners, according to Thomas Renard, who says data has only been used by the intelligence services and the police so far.
I think now is perhaps the time to move to something more institutionalized, where we could have access to a bigger set of data. I mean, CV practitioners have gathered extensive data on radicalization and terrorists over the past few years. This data, as to this day and to the best of my knowledge, is and has not been exploited except by those services. But this is something that would be extremely useful for scholars, academics like myself and others to be able to dig into and to analyze, to then further contribute to practitioners with something helpful. And so I think now we have this ability to conduct studies based on a very large end with lots of cases, radicalized individuals, non-violent, but also comparing that with control samples of terrorist convicts and also with control samples of the broader population, non-radicalized population. This is where I think we can go now.
According to Bibi van Ginkel, trust is key to building bridges between researchers, policymakers and practitioners. This was also highlighted several times during the research seminar.
It's often overlooked how important it is and how time-consuming good research is to invest in trust relationships with your stakeholder community in order to get the questions out there, etc., and to get the right answers. That takes time, and time is money, and so they often have to deal with not enough funds to actually complete the research, and to also allow some freedom and flexibility. I mean, I often had situations in which we presented a new topic and a new what we thought was an important issue on the table, whereas policymakers at that point said, well, no, we don't think that that's relevant at the moment, and by the way, we don't have funds, and 6 months later it's the hot topic on the table. And if only they had invested some money in some preliminary research mapping, then already we would have been in a better information position than when the shit already hits the fan.
Research should not be conducted in isolation, but in collaboration with policymakers and practitioners as a trialogue. For successful collaboration, relationship and trust building is important. This can be achieved by organizing more opportunities for interaction to understand the needs of each stakeholder in terms of setting priorities and enabling sufficient budget for research.